And how does that toxic culture impact women and men differently? Because in your book, you go into detail about autoimmune diseases and how it's linked to the way that we raise women in society. Can you speak to that, of just the gender differences?
Sure. So when we talk about the patriarchy, first we have to understand we're not talking about any kind of a conscious or even or a conspiracy on the part of men. That's not what we're talking about. Men suffer just as women suffer. It's just that the suffering takes different forms. Some salient facts. Women are twice as likely to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder as men are. A woman with severe post-traumatic stress disorder has double the risk of ovarian cancer.
Wow.
The link between the mind and the body. Women are much more likely to be taking antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication than men are. 70 to 80% of autoimmune disease happens to women, such as rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, sclerodermia, lupus. There's about 60 of these conditions: chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, colitis, Crohn's disease. On the other hand, when it comes to suicide and addictions, men are, or to death, or death by mutual violence, that's more likely to happen to men. So that there's an unequal distribution of suffering, but both genders suffer.
Right.
So then the question is why? So that to look at autoimmune disease, so in my family practice, and also I worked for 7 years as a palliative care physician before I turned to addiction medicine, I noticed that there's certain personality patterns that are associated with chronic illness. So, for example, people prone to autoimmune disease or malignancy tend to be people who repress their emotions, like healthy anger. They tend to be people who think of the emotional needs of others ahead of their own. They tend to be people who want to be nice and compliant and peacemakers. They tend to be people who believe that they're responsible for what other people feel and they must never disappoint anybody. Now, I can talk about physiologically why these emotional traits promote illness. But even before I go on, let me ask you, of the two major genders in a society, I'm talking about statistically, which is the one that's acculturated to suppressing their healthy anger, serving the needs of others, taking on the stresses of others, and ignoring their own? It's women. That's how we raise girls.
Yeah.
And that's why women have more autoimmune disease, because these patterns that suppress emotions and the authentic self also imbalance the immune system. And that's because, well, let me give you a really clear example, just to make it really clear. If I were to, any of you, if I were to be rude or inappropriate or insulting to any of you, what would be some of the healthy responses that you could make to that right now in this setting? What could you do?
Set a boundary, right?
Yeah. The other thing you could do, just to get angry. You can't talk to me that way.
Right.
You can't talk to me that way. In other words, you're intruding on my space here. You can't do that. That's healthy anger. We share that circuit in our brain for healthy anger with all mammals. Healthy anger is simply a boundary defense. You got that? It says, you're in my space, get out.
Could another name for that also be righteous anger? I've heard, at least my therapist has talked a little bit about.
Yeah, you could call that righteous anger, though. When I think about it, it's when I see an injustice.
Okay. Whether to somebody else or myself.
Yeah, and then healthy anger. What I'm talking about is simply a personal boundary defense. Now, what's the role of the emotions in general? And I talk about this in the book. So this is what it looks like. Okay, the myth of normal, trauma, illness, and healing in a toxic culture. So I talk about this in the book. So what's the role of the emotional system in general? The role of the emotional system is to allow in what is healthy and nurturing and to keep out what is unhealthy and unwelcome. So Jamie had some kind of an issue this morning, but because of the relationship between Justin and Jamie allowed Justin's supportive and inviting words and energy in, and went along with it. If Justin had approached Jamie, just to give an example, with disdain or contempt or hostility, then Jamie would not have let that in. That would be a healthy response. So the role of the emotional system is to allow in what's healthy, keep out what isn't. Now, let me ask you guys a skill testing question. You won't have to think a long time about this. What's the role of the immune system?
To defend and protect.
To protect the body.
It's the same thing. It's to let in what is healthy, the nutrients, and to keep out what's unhealthy. Unhealthy bacteria.
Our immune system sets boundaries.
Yeah, it sets boundaries that lets some things in and keep. Now, here's the scientific fact that's not even controversial from the scientific point of view, but which is not taught to medical students, incredibly, that the mind and the body are inseparable, and the emotional system and the immune system are part and parcel of the same apparatus. So when you suppress the emotions, you're also suppressing the immune system.
Yes.
So that when you imbalance your emotions, you're also imbalancing your immune system, and that's why those emotional traits of self-suppression also turn the immune system against you, and that's why women have more autoimmune disease, because they're programmed to do that, not by gender, biological gender, but by the demands of the patriarchal culture. So that's what I mean. Partly what I mean by a toxic culture. So let me give you an example. There was a study out of Massachusetts. They looked at 2,000 women over 10 years. Those women that were unhappily married but didn't express their emotions were 4 times as likely to die as those women who were also unhappily married, but they did express their emotions.
Wow. Then you also talk about anger for men, right? That after a rage event or a big anger event for men, they're 4 times more likely to then have a heart attack or have a heart incident, right? So there's also the flip side, which is so fascinating, the way that gender plays into these things.
Yeah.
You have a few very successful psychologist speakers that are appealing directly to men today.
Yeah.
And one of the things you just said in response was you mentioned the patriarchy, which we mention very often on this show.
Yeah.
But there are a few, and we can just say, like, as an example, Jordan Peterson, who I do not think is all bad by any means, but I don't agree with everything that he says. One of the things I don't agree with is that he doesn't believe the patriarchy exists. And I would just be curious, because you've come out and publicly disagreed with him a few times. I'm just curious what your argument for why the patriarchy exists would be if you were going to be sitting with him and we were having a discussion.
Yeah, well, first of all, the problem is that when sometimes the word patriarchy is used, men immediately perceive themselves as being attacked.
Exactly.
They think they're being criticized, which is not the case. That's why in the beginning I said, when I say patriarchy, I'm not talking about a conspiracy on the part of man. I'm talking about a culture. Okay? I quote David Foster Wallace, the late and great American author, who at a commencement address at a university gives this anecdote. And he says that two young fish are swimming along in the stream or wherever, and this older fish comes along and says, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim along for a while, and then one of them turns to the other one and says, "What the hell is water?" and Foster Wallace's point is, and actually let me find this in the book, it is right in the introduction. The point that Wallace wanted to leave his audience pondering was, and I'm quoting him, "The most obvious, ubiquitous, important realities are often the ones hardest to see and talk about."
Wow.
Because we're too close to them, we don't see them. And then he says, on the surface, this might sound like a quote banal platitude, but then he says, in the day-to-day trenches of adult existence, banal platitudes can have life or death importance. And he was summing up the thesis of my whole book. Now, Peterson is so close to the patriarchy, and he's so entrenched in his ideology that he cannot see it. It's in the nature of any ideology is that you don't see that it's an ideology. You think you're looking at reality.